Hi, I'm Jack, but everyone just calls me Jake. I worked as a camp counselor for 6 years, and I absolutely loved it. I enjoyed being outdoors, hanging out with the other counselors, staying in the woods, and teaching the younger campers about the wonders of nature. But then one summer came along that changed everything about that job. Normally, campers would stay for a week and then go home, and counselors would have a week to themselves before the next group arrived. This routine continued from May to August. I remember that summer vividly. It was the last week of camp, and we were all excited for our final week. We had planned a special activity for the kids, which we would surprise them with towards the end of the week. The surprise was a hike into the woods where we would set up a real campsite and spend the last 3 nights sleeping outside by the fire. We had planned to tell ghost stories, roast marshmallows, and make s'mores, but none of that came to pass. As the kids arrived at camp and settled into the cabin, they unpacked their belongings and began chatting, getting to know one another, except for one camper, whom I later learned was named Max. Our camp is structured differently from others. We allow boys and girls to sleep in the same cabin since our camp caters to ages 6 to 10, with separate sides for each gender. Our facilities are quite limited, consisting of a single cabin, a main office, and a cafeteria. Our activities are exclusively outdoors, but we operate on a very tight budget. Max was different from the other campers. He didn't unpack his things. In fact, it seemed he hadn't brought anything at all. He stood in the corner while the other kids claimed their beds. Thinking he might be shy, I walked over and introduced myself. "Hello, I'm Jake, and I'll be one of your counselors for this week. Are you ready to have some fun?" Max stood there with a blank expression, not saying a word, and simply turned away from me. I suspected he was one of those campers whose parents had forced them to attend, rather than coming of their own volition. However, I was determined to lift his spirits. Our first activity was a game of kickball in the clearing. I divided the campers into teams and we started the game. The campers were thoroughly enjoying themselves, laughing and playfully accusing each other of making wrong plays, joking and engaging in friendly competition. Then I noticed Max. He had wandered away from the group and was standing off to the side, gazing into the woods. Not wanting to single him out in front of the other campers, I decided to keep a discreet watch on him. He remained there for the duration of the game, and none of the other counselors approached him. Ryan came over to me and asked, "What's going on with that camper over there?" "That's Max. I believe he's a bit introverted," I responded. "I see," Ryan replied before walking away again. It wasn't long before we left that activity and headed to the cafeteria for lunch. After seating the campers, I went to collect their food. I laid it all out on the table and we all began to eat. Max, however, did not. He simply sat there, staring at his plate. "Aren't you hungry?" I asked him. He looked at me without saying anything. "You should eat before our next activity. It will require a lot of energy. We're going canoeing," I added with enthusiasm, hoping to excite Max as well. Instead, his eyes widened with what seemed like fear, and he lowered his gaze to the ground, maintaining that posture until we finished eating. When we arrived at the river, Ryan, the other counselor, had already set the canoes out on the water and had life vests ready for the kids. We both distributed the vests, helped the campers into them, and then, one by one, sent them out to load into a canoe. When it was Max's turn, his demeanor shifted dramatically from quiet and shy to loud and frantic. He kicked, screamed, and pleaded with us not to make him get in the water, insisting that he was terrified of it and couldn't bring himself to enter. Ryan tried to reassure him, explaining that the lifeguard would be assisting us and that we would be right there if anything were to happen. Max, however, was inconsolable, and it began to feel like we were torturing him by trying to persuade him. "Stop it, Ryan," I said firmly. "I'll sit with him. He doesn't have to do it if he is truly scared. I will not force a camper to do anything they are uncomfortable with." As Ryan, the lifeguard, and the other campers ventured out into the river, I sat on the bench with Max. At first, it was very quiet, just as I had expected, but then Max spoke. "Thank you, you saved me," he said. "No problem, kiddo," I said, ruffling his hair. It felt damp, even though he had never entered the water. Did he shower? No, that couldn't be. I would have noticed, and he hadn't had the time. Eventually, the campers returned from their excursion, and we all headed back to the cabin. Later that night, after I thought all the campers had fallen asleep, I was preparing for bed myself when I saw Max reflected in the mirror behind me. He startled me, causing me to jump and turn around. I laughed it off and said, "Max, you need to go to bed." "I can't sleep," he murmured, his voice sounding weak and muffled. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked him. "I want to go home," he replied. "That's just your nerves. I'm sure if you fall asleep, by morning you'll feel a lot better and change your mind. Just try to have a good time. It's only the first night. I promise you'll have fun," I assured him. He turned his gaze to the floor before disappearing into the darkened room where the other campers were already settled. The next morning, during roll call, I discovered that Max was missing. We searched the entire cabin, but he was nowhere to be found. Panicked, I sprinted to the main office and burst into the director's office. "Mr. Thompson, I have a missing camper," I exclaimed frantically. "All right, calm down," he said. "We'll find him. What's his name so I can pull up his information, contact his parents, and notify the authorities?" "His name is Max Sumner," I replied. Mr. Thompson began typing on his computer, but his face quickly shifted to one of confusion and anger. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "No, sir. I swear. It's not," I responded, completely baffled as to why he would think I'd joke about something so serious. "I don't have a camper listed under the name Max Sumner," he said, his tone now filled with skepticism. My heart dropped. "Well, then there's a missing child on our campus who was under my supervision. I know what I'm talking about, and we need to find him. He has longer red hair, green eyes, and pale skin with freckles," I insisted, my voice shaking with urgency. "We'll call the authorities and see what they can do," Mr. Thompson replied. While he made the call, Jacob and I had the difficult task of contacting the other campers' parents to explain the situation and ask for their help. Some parents offered to assist with the search, but most came only to pick up their kids and scold us for losing one. When the authorities finally arrived, they sent a search team while an officer came to speak with me. He asked for a more detailed description of the boy and his name. "His name is Max Sumner," I said. The officer left and returned shortly. He murmured something to Mr. Thompson, whose face went from anger to a deeply disturbed look, as though he'd just received a baffling piece of news. The officer then approached me again, asking me to describe the boy once more. After I finished, the officer's face darkened, and he frowned. "We don't find situations like this funny, ma'am," he said firmly. "I'm not joking. Why does everyone think I'm joking?" I asked, frustration and confusion in my voice. "Because Max Sumner was an 8-year-old boy who drowned in the river 4 years ago," the officer replied. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt dizzy. The world seemed to blur around me. It was the same river where we had taken the campers canoeing. I suddenly remembered hearing his story on the news. His photo. How had I not recognized him sooner? The officer seemed ready to arrest me, but Jacob spoke up, confirming that he too had seen Max. The officer took down both Jacob's and my statements before leaving with the search team. Mr. Thompson called us into his office to discuss the situation. He angrily accused us of staging a cruel prank about something so serious and tragic. Despite our insistence that we were telling the truth, the argument escalated into a heated confrontation, and it ultimately led to my resignation. I now work as a game warden, which allows me to still enjoy nature without the fear of encountering any more ghostly children. I hope. It's hard to believe that they almost arrested me, thinking it was some twisted joke.